Okay, this will be my last sermon in this series of people in the Bible that God called. Now, I have not exhausted the list of people in the Bible that God called to serve Him, but this is the last in this series. And we're dealing with the prophet Habakkuk and his book, beginning with the first chapter and the first verse. The oracle that Habakkuk the prophet received. How long, O Lord, must I call for help, but you do not listen? Or cry out to you violence, but you do not save? Why do you make me look at injustice? Why do you tolerate wrong? Destruction and violence are before me. There is strife and conflict abounds. Therefore the law is paralyzed and justice never prevails. The wicked hymn in the righteousness so that justice is perverted. Look at the nations and watch. Be utterly amazed, for I am going to do something in your days that you would not believe even if you were told. I am raising up the Babylonians, that ruthless and impetuous people who sweep across the whole earth to seize dwelling places not their own. They are a feared and dreaded people. They are a law to themselves and promote their own honor. Their horses are swifter than leopards, fiercer than wolves at dusk. Their cavalry gallops headlong. Their horsemen come from afar. They fly like a vulture swooping to devour. They all come bent on violence. Their hordes advance like a desert wind and gather their prisoners like sand. They deride kings and scoff at rulers. They laugh at all fortified cities. They build earthen ramps and capture them. Then they sweep past like the wind and go on. Guilty men whose own strength is their God. O Lord, are you not from everlasting? My God, my Holy One, we will not die. O Lord, you have appointed them to execute judgment. O Rock, you have ordained them to punish. Your eyes are too pure to look on evil. You cannot tolerate wrong. Why then do you tolerate the treacherous? Why are you silent while the wicked swallow up those more righteous than themselves? You have made men like fish in the sea, like creatures that have no rulers. The wicked foe pulls all of them up with hooks. He catches them in his net. He gathers them up in his dragnet, so rejoices and is glad. Therefore he sacrifices to his net and burns incense to his dragnet. For by his net he lives in luxury and enjoys the choices of food. Is he to keep on emptying his net, destroying nations without mercy? I will stand at my watch and station myself on the ramparts. I will look to see what he will say to me and what answer I am giving to this complaint. Then the Lord answered, write down the revelation and make it plain on tablets, so that a herald may run with it. For the revelation awaits an appointed time. It speaks of the end and will not prove false. Though it linger, wait for it. It will certainly come and will not delay. Now we've had, as we've gone through the series, we've seen different ways that God called His people. And most of us have never had a call like anyone we've talked about so far. I've never seen a burning bush. I've never put out my fleece and had the fleece covered with dew and the ground dry, or vice versa. We don't get those calls often. But Habakkuk's call is unique in Scripture. Because the book of Habakkuk does not start with, thus saith the Lord, or the word of the Lord came to Habakkuk. In fact, it doesn't start with God speaking at all. It starts with Habakkuk speaking. And it starts with Habakkuk complaining to God. Now, that's a starting place I can relate to. And I'm sure it's a starting place a lot of you can relate to. God, what is going on in the world? God, why aren't you doing something to fix things? You ever feel that way? You ever even actually say that to God? God, I trust you. But I look at the world and I don't see what you are doing. I think we can all relate to that. There's violence being done. Justice is corrupt. Rich people get richer at the expense of poor people that they're exploiting. All of Habakkuk's complaints did not end when he finished writing his book. They're still present with us. And to his first complaint, God says, watch. Be amazed. Because you're not going to believe what's going to happen. Now, again, he's not giving Habakkuk a command here yet to do anything except to watch. And so I get the impression that there's a bit of time before this first complaint and God's answer to Habakkuk's second complaint. I get a feeling like he's been waiting and watching, and he's like, okay, God, I'm waiting and I'm watching and I'm not seeing what you promised. So he says, I'm going to stand watch. I'm going to keep watching. And it's only at this point that God gives Habakkuk something to do. It's only at this point, after Habakkuk has shared his concerns with God more than once, that God turns to Habakkuk and says, okay, here's what I want you to do about it. There's an old cartoon. This man is kneeling by his bed praying and goes, God, there's so much wrong in the world today. Why aren't you doing anything about it? And the voice from heaven answers, I was just about to ask you the same question. Because we know that one of the way God works is through us, through his followers. And I think too often we want the burning bush. We want the clarity that Moses got. I mean, God speaks to Moses, and God speaks to Moses for 3 chapters in the book of Exodus. It's the longest account of any call in Scripture. And God gives Moses detailed commands. And he says, this is what I want you to do. This is what's going to happen. I have very rarely gotten detailed commands from God. Very rarely have I heard God say, okay, here's what I want you to do, and here's what's going to happen. God called me to be a preacher. But when he called me, he didn't say, and you're going to serve this church for 5 years, and then you're going to move on and serve this church for 10, and then you're going to move on and you're going to serve this church as an interim for 6 months. He may have planned out my career, but he didn't tell me the plan. And there were times that would have been comforting to know. What's going to happen? I'm afraid most of us won't get that. But the good news is we don't need to wait for that. Yes, that assurance would be wonderful. But we don't need to wait for that. God called Habakkuk before he realized he'd been called, because God laid a concern upon Habakkuk's heart. It didn't start with a cause. It didn't start with a call. It started with a concern. And because we look for the spectacular, because we look for the miraculous, a lot of times we miss the voice of God in the less spectacular. Because while many of you would say to me, if I ask, no, God's not called me to anything. If I ask, has God ever laid a concern upon your heart? I bet you would all say yes. Have you ever gotten so concerned about someone or something that you had to go to God with it? This is how, for most of us, our call begins. God puts a concern in our heart. God puts a complaint in our heart that we take back to God and say, God, look at what's going on. As if God didn't know. I mean, we know God knows what's going on, but we still say, God, don't you know what's going on? Can't you see what's happening? Why don't you do something? And if we do that enough, and then if we give God time to answer us, this is the difficult part. It's easy to go to God and say, okay, God, here's everything that's going on bad that I want you to fix. Goodbye. And go on with our lives. But if we spend time in prayer listening, oftentimes God will say, okay, here's what we're going to do about it. Here's what I want you to do about it. And before you know it, you've been called. If you have a concern for someone, if you have a concern for something, sometimes it comes from the strangest places. I've served at churches where I've had members enter the mission field because of a concern that God laid on their lives from strange places. I have a friend who is a missionary in Belize. He's from Africa. And he decided to be a missionary in Belize. He was called to be a missionary in Belize after reading a magazine article about a church school in Belize. Now, I doubted the person who wrote that article thought that that article was going to lead someone into the mission field. The article was written to raise money for the missionary. And it was 20 years from the time he read that article till he actually made it to the mission field, because he was a young man when he read it, still in high school. And he went on and went to college and seminary and got a career. And then the church that was running the church school said, we ought to have a pastor at this church. And they put out a call. And as soon as he heard that they were looking for a pastor, he knew that that concern that was laid on his life 20 years before was his calling. Are you concerned about your neighbor? Are you concerned about a family member? Take your concerns to God, yes. But then, like the prophet Habakkuk, wait and watch and listen. And be willing and faithful when God says, okay, you're concerned about your neighbor. Here's what I want you to do. You're concerned about your nephew. Here's what I want you to do. You're concerned about people who don't have access to clean drinking water. Here's what I want you to do. Whatever your concern is, listen for God's leading, because God gave you that concern, and He's going to give you a call to do something about it. Our final hymn is number 590.